Well, hello everybody. It's a great pleasure to be able to spend a little time today exploring some of these big issues that confront us in a world with diminishing ecological capacities at a time of expanding economic development. And really the main point I want to address today, at least in outline, is this enormous misconception that I think is amongst the most dangerous that afflicts modern society in the extent to which we see a choice existing between ecology and economic development. And it's all around us. You can see it day after day. You hear it from the Chancellor of the Exchequer. You hear it from politics more broadly. You hear it coming from the White House. The idea that we can't protect nature and ecology because we have more important jobs to do in generating jobs and economic growth. It's there in the sound bites from the Chancellor urging us to see that there's no point in trying to save nature because if we put our country out of business, it's not going to save the planet. And not only are we presented with this false choice where nature is seen as something which is an alternative to the economy, we're actually being told now that nature, if we look at it from the point of view of environmental regulations, is a drag on development that we simply can't afford to have. Now, you just spend half a second thinking about this and you think this is complete and utter madness, and of course it is, because 100% of our economic development and well-being is based upon what natural systems provide for us, and that's why I spent the last year deciding to try and put into plain terms why this is a huge mistake to be looking at the world in these ways, and instead to be looking at ecology as actually the basis of human welfare into the future. And if we don't do that, of course, we'll be courting ever more serious peril as we promote climatic impacts, loss of biodiversity, and shortages of key natural resources like water. So I started to write this down in a book called What Has Nature Ever Done for Us? And I thought it would be good just to put this out there as a simple question and then to provide the data which backs up the idea that this is indeed a huge mistake to be pursuing development in this particular false dichotomy. And I started to do the research and discovered that there is an absolute mass of scientific information out there right now. It's buried in technical journals, it's written in quite esoteric academic terms, but finding that resource and turning it into a popular narrative, I found a hugely powerful experience. And of course, one of the things that powers modern society, and we hardly hear about it, and in fact we dismiss it as dirt, something to be washed away and kept outside, is of course the soil. And soil is one of those things which is actually powering the entire planet. Not only is it, of course, this huge repository of biological diversity, from where we've got most of our modern antibiotics from the animals, the creatures living in there, but also is, of course, one of the ways in which we mitigate climate impacts in the world through absorbing carbon dioxide. And indeed, there's more carbon dioxide in the world's peat soils than there is in the atmosphere, and yet we dig up those peat soils, we release the carbon dioxide, and we build wind turbines and nuclear power stations instead, when in fact it would be much cheaper to keep the peat soils intact. The soils also, of course, are providing us with about 90% of our food, and that's something which we treat as, take it for granted that this will always be there. And yet across the world, even in some of the soils which are being well managed, relatively well managed, you find that there is something like a soil loss rate of 10 to 100 times more rapid than the soil is accumulating from the geological weathering going on beneath. The other place, of course, where we get an awful lot of our food is the oceans. And not only do we derive a lot of seafood out of the world's seas in the form of the food chains being powered by the sun, from planktonic algae to zooplankton to small fish to big fish, which is feeding hundreds of millions of people worldwide, and indeed for 1 billion people is their principal source of protein. We're also generating hundreds of millions of jobs and generating about $240 billion worth of gross domestic product, all for free, being powered by the sun, being powered by algae. And of course, the oceans, like many ecosystems on land, are absorbing vast amounts of carbon dioxide. About a third of the CO2 that we've put into the atmosphere from fossil fuel combustion and deforestation has already been sucked up by the oceans for nothing. And the coastal mangroves, which are doing part of that job, also are fish nurseries too. We also tend to forget that the coccolithophores, the tiny planktonic organisms living in the surface of the ocean, are releasing chemicals into the atmosphere which are causing rain clouds to form. One of the things that we rely on for agriculture on land, of course, is rain, and those tiny planktonic organisms are one of the ways in which rainfall clouds are being generated, in the process also cooling the planet at the same time. Those kinds of services, certainly from the point of view of food production and carbon absorption, are being damaged right now. Overfishing on the one hand, and the buildup of CO2 not only warming the oceans, but also causing them to become more acidic. And that, of course, is leading to changes in the ecology which might interrupt those kinds of systems. But assuming the rain continues to fall on land, what happens to it before it comes out of our taps? Well, one of the things, of course, that's happening to it is it's being filtered by different kinds of ecosystems. And during the course of the research for this book, I went to Colombia, to Bogota, and found out there about how the Paramo ecosystem on top of the Andes Mountains is the main way in which the city of 10 million people is being provided with fresh water year in, year out. It's being filtered by the upland peat bogs. That's coming down, and as it's coming down, it's being purified and provided to the city in a way that otherwise would cost literally billions of dollars more. I found the same thing in New York City, where the water supply is being filtered by the Catskill Mountains, and where literally billions of dollars are being wiped off the water bills of the people living in the city because of the jobs being done by nature. In many other parts of the world, in the subtropical and tropical regions, I also discovered how cloud forests are a particularly important part of the water cycle, including for some of the world's biggest cities like Dar es Salaam. Cloud forests form on the side of mountains at about 2,000 meters, and even when it's not raining in the valleys below, these cloud forest ecosystems are harvesting moisture out of the clouds, from the lichens and the leaves and the mosses on the trees. They're pulling the water in and taking it down into the leaf mold beneath the trees, where you may have 1.5 meters of rotting vegetation, which is like a great sponge holding the water. And in the dry season, for cities like Dar es Salaam, when it's not raining, these cloud forests are still harvesting moisture from the atmosphere, and it's coming down the rivers. The rivers are still flowing, so that irrigation and industry can still continue, even when it's not raining. And of course, these kinds of ecosystems are not only providing us with water, they're also protecting us from severe flood events. I remember in June 2007 watching the television on the BBC News and seeing people being rescued by helicopter from rooftops during a massive flood. The shocking thing about that, because we see this the whole time, the shocking thing about that for me was not that the people were being rescued from a rooftop, but it was in England, it was in Sheffield. People were being taken off of a rooftop in the downtown area there because of a massive flash flood that had come down the River Don and basically sealed off the city centre. Now that flood, obviously it was caused by heavy rain, but it was made so much worse by the removal of the forests and the damage to the peat bogs on the Pennines nearby. And we find this time and again around the world, and indeed there's now academic research telling us how these kinds of flood events are becoming more serious in direct proportion to the amount of deforestation going on. It's costing us billions, not least through the money we're paying in insurance. And it's not only terrestrial ecosystems that are protecting us from these kinds of flood events, it's obviously also those around the coastal areas of the world. I looked into the impacts of Hurricane Katrina during the course of writing What Has Nature Ever Done for Us, and saw a comparative analysis between the impacts of Katrina and another storm called Rita, which came ashore about 400 kilometers to the west about 3 weeks later. Hurricane Katrina killed 1,600 people. Hurricane Rita killed 7 people. And one of the big differences between these two storms was the fact that Katrina came ashore in an area where the coastal wetlands had been degraded, they'd been dug up, they'd been drained, and they'd had large channels put through them. Effectively, the bioshield that existed on the coast had been damaged, and the storm caused so much more impact when it went inland. Rita came ashore in a place where the coastal habitats were pretty much intact, and the power of the storm was removed. And you find this story repeated across the world. The 2004 tsunami that hit parts of Southeast Asia, very similar findings were made there. Where the mangroves remained intact, where the coral reefs remained intact, the coastal devastation was much, much less. A free, massive, multi-billion-dollar insurance policy is provided by nature for us, and yet year by year we degrade it and we destroy it in the name of economic development. I also came across stories around the extent to which nature protects us from disease. And perhaps the most powerful story I came to was learning about the loss of the vultures in India. Now, I went to India in the early 1990s, and I remember landing at New Delhi International Airport and seeing these birds flying around the buildings, and they were visible in the countryside outside. 10 years later, the 40 million vultures that lived in India had pretty much disappeared. They'd nearly gone extinct, and those 3 birds now are critically endangered, the 3 species of vulture that were once common. 40 million birds gone. And they went like that. They went very quickly, and the reason they went very quickly was the introduction of a veterinary drug called diclofenac. Now, diclofenac is a wonder drug. If you've got a sick cow, you inject this stuff into it, and the cow runs about and looks very healthy. Trouble is, should the cow die within a week or so of being injected, it has quantities of diclofenac in its bloodstream, and if a vulture bites into that dead corpse, the vulture dies very quickly. Now, hundreds of vultures will descend upon one cow corpse, and in the process of injecting one cow that then dies, you wipe out the local population of vultures. And across the entire subcontinent, 40 million of these birds went very rapidly. Now, those birds were between them eating each year about 12 million tons of putrefying meat that was left in the countryside. You take the vultures away, even inadvertently, something else is going to eat that meat. And in this case, it was feral dogs. And the feral dog population rocketed when the vultures went up by 7 million animals. And these are not nice little dogs that sit in your kitchen and obey commands like sit and lay. These are vicious wild creatures that carry disease. And indeed, they carried disease into rural areas in particular, to the point where some researchers estimated that some 50,000 people extra died as a result of this increase in dog population because of the incidence of rabies. People were being bitten by these extra dogs. Researchers turned these kinds of public health statistics into numbers that could be used by economists, and they reckon that the loss of the vultures in India has cost the Indian economy about $34 billion between 1993 and 2006. That is a vast amount of money. I also found ways in which nature is helping us to deal with disease in other ecosystems. Lyme's disease, I'm sure many of us have come across this, at least hearing about the risks of being infected by ticks that bite people if you're in certain kinds of countryside. Well, be reassured that in areas where the mammal diversity is higher, where there's more small mammals like deer, like mice, like rabbits, you get bitten less. And the same thing goes for West Nile virus, which is transmitted by mosquitoes. In the case of the West Nile virus, you get bitten less if there's more birds around. So the birds are absorbing the mosquito bites, the animals are absorbing the tick bites, and as a result of both of these dynamics, human infections are lower. We also know that being in contact with nature has huge benefits for chronic disease, chronic illness, and also psychological illnesses, literally worth billions of dollars a year. But how much do we design our public health policies around exposure to running water, to trees, to greenery, and to the other things that we know are so therapeutic? And of course, we know about the role of pest control in agriculture and the multi-million and indeed multi-billion dollar benefits that are coming from that side too. One piece of research I reviewed concerned the role of small songbirds called great tits in a Dutch apple orchard. These things eat caterpillars, and a couple of researchers did a forensic piece of analysis to look at the extent to which the birds were actually helping the apple crop at the end of the growing season. Would you believe they discovered that 50% of the apple crop was down to the activities of these small songbirds? You take the birds away, you get half as many apples. And of course, in the process of promoting the birds, you need to use a whole lot less chemicals. The list goes on and on and on. The design solutions we're gaining from inspiration from nature. So the whole idea of biomimicry and using design solutions already forged by evolutionary forces and applying those to engineering. We know very well about the way in which we gain an awful lot from drugs and agricultural produce derived from wild species, but we're learning more and more and more about how we can design super efficient technologies of the future for harvesting water, for making wind turbines more efficient, for design of buildings, through looking at the ways in which animals and plants have already solved some of the very same problems that we are grappling with. And then perhaps the thing that's most familiar to all of us, but is in some ways quite profound in explaining this whole idea I'm unpacking here today, is the effects of pollination and the extent to which pretty much most of our food, well, 2/3 of our food species are reliant on animal pollinators to complete the sexual reproduction process between plants in ways that enables us to eat. This is worth literally tens of billions of dollars a year worldwide. But for me, the importance of the pollination example is not only about the extent to which it feeds us, it's also underlining the extent to which nature is not only about things like soils, like water, like peat bogs, it's also about relationships and the extent to which the whole system is an integrated whole that depends on other aspects of it in order for it to function. It is literally one global system that we live within. It's called the biosphere. And it seemed to me, during the course of writing this piece, that the big challenge we face in the world today is not so much about protecting little bits of nature, but it's about embedding that interrelated, interconnected system inside an economic paradigm which is fit for purpose, which actually understands that the economy is not something which owns ecology, but to see the economy as it truly is, as a wholly owned subsidiary of ecology and the natural environment. That obviously is a huge wrench, and I think most politicians in this country find it very hard to see what is really quite an obvious set of connections. But I do believe that there is a great deal of hope for us in being able to navigate the tricky ecological crunches that lie ahead of us, not least because there is now so much understanding and so much information out there about the dynamic relationship between ecology and economics, and the extent to which we can now start putting numbers on one to inform the other. Now, I've spent much of my professional career campaigning for nature because nature is worth protecting for its own sake. It has intrinsic values that go beyond any instrumental kind of values we might place upon it. It does need protecting for its own sake. But I am also convinced that the new research that's coming out now, demonstrating the economic value of nature, is absolutely vital for us to put into the mainstream debates. And I don't see that as an alternative to us taking a moral stance, or to say that nature has values that go beyond the prices we can put upon it. I think these two things need to go hand in hand. We need to rebuild our connections with nature. We need to have a spiritual education in this country and elsewhere indeed to put us back inside the natural world. But we also need to be building a different economic system, and I think that economic system will not only come from the provision of good numbers and putting good arguments together, but it will also come from the different kind of relationships we all have with nature, that profound reconnection. And I think if I had one priority that I would put at the top of the national curriculum today for ministers to be thinking about in terms of how we rebuild our society, it would be to put a natural history GCSE right there as a compulsory piece of education that all our young people would do, to learn about birdsong, to learn about the names of trees, to be able to identify butterflies, and to see humans in the natural world in their correct place, in the center of it and not outside. Thank you very much indeed.